Greetings, class. Due to inclement weather, we are not meeting Wednesday night. This is actually Tuesday night. I'm starting to record these now ahead of time. We haven't had to do this before, and so I wanted to allow time in case there were any issues in terms of getting these recorded or uploaded. I'm going to actually do these a little bit differently. Usually I post just two videos, one from the first half of our session, one from the second half of our session, but I find it a little bit more challenging to sit here in the office and talk directly at the computer for 3 straight hours. So I'm going to break these up, and I'm going to try to do this here in a way that makes sense topically in terms of how we've been approaching class. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint here that I have for you. There we go, our lovely PowerPoint. So, Japan. Some of the sites that you would see uh, in Japan. I selected all of these pretty much from Tokyo, the main city of Japan. Right here, we have the Meiji Shrine. Um, right here, we have the one of the tallest structures in the world. I believe it's the third tallest now. At the time, it was completed in 2011, 2012. It was, I think, the tallest briefly, but I believe in Malaysia and Dubai, uh, taller towers have since been constructed. But this is called the Tokyo Sky Tree, and it's still, I believe, the third tallest structure in the world. It's a couple thousand feet. Right here is the Imperial Palace. Yes, the imperial family is still a thing, as we shall see. And then right down here, we have the Diet building. This is like the Parliament building. So, uh, this is Japan's flag. We are also going to do the national anthem here in just a moment. It's called Kimigayo. It's the national anthem of Japan. The lyrics from a poem that actually comes from it's 1,000 years ago, and the current melody was chosen. Actually, it's interesting. In 1880, the composer was a Japanese student of John William Fenton, who wrote the original. And then there was kind of a final version that was polished up by Franz Eckert. The title, which is a little was a little bit controversial when this was being debated in the 1990s, um, because it's translated as roughly His Imperial Majesty's reign. And during the debate on the passage of the Act on National Flag and Anthem in 1989, there was kind of a question because the emperor has a dignified function, not an efficient function. And so the argument was that it could also be translated as sort of the people, or that the emperor represents the people, or something of that nature. But it evolved from being a traditional song um, sung during various feast days, and then it was gradually adopted during the nation-making period of the late 19th century, which we'll talk about. And when the the Second Empire, was dissolved in World War II, that was kept on, much like the emperor himself. Let me just bring up the anthem here that I have for you. And here we go. All right. So there you have it. I always like to give you some sort of uh, different engagement there rather than just me talking at you, which is what this is most of the time. So I'm going to bring up first a map of uh, of Japan's surroundings, and then also a political map, just so that you can kind of familiarize yourself with the geography of what I'm talking about here, because I will obviously mention several facts critical to Japan's geography here as we talk about the history. I always start by giving you some context in terms of the history of the place that we're talking about, since history does uh, impact politics so much. And so here we have Japan. As you can see, it's actually a series of islands. There are actually a lot of islands, but there are four main islands here. And as you can see here, we have the Korean Peninsula and China, and this up here is actually Russia. And then up here, kind of off the screen, you have Alaska and the Aleutians. So, Japanese peoples are part of essentially the Sinosphere. Um, this would not be a popular thing to say, but when we look at many Japanese words, customs, we can see that these probably migrated from the Korean Peninsula, from mainland China. The Japanese and Korean languages are highly related. Some scholars even suggest that the imperial family is of Korean origin, which is a controversial point. But Japan and Korea both owe much to Chinese culture. Many Japanese words are Chinese. As I said, Japan has four main islands, making it very hard to unify. It's very mountainous. Japan has little arable land, and much of it's devoted to rice. There was an original people there, the Ainu, who had to be fought off the land. And so very early on, a sort of warrior ethos developed, something that was going to be very important because, as we're going to see, in Japan, we see probably the closest thing to Western European feudalism that we've found anywhere in the world. Just a couple of interesting points that you might like to note. The Great Mongol Empire that spread itself across much of Asia in the 13th century. They had tried under Kublai Khan to move across into Japan, and the fleet was wrecked in a series of storms. The kamikaze, the divine wind, that's where that comes from. Most of you are probably familiar with that, if you're familiar with it at all, in terms of the World War II reference, 1945, the kamikaze pilots. So Japan was long dominated by clans and their leaders. Uh, Central Japan had largely been unified by about the time of the collapse of what we think of as the late Roman imperial period. Um, and feudalism is going to sort of grow out of this kind of collapse of central authority, which is going to occur from the 9th to the 12th centuries and lead to several centuries of feudalism, essentially only ending in the 19th century. Now, China, which we're going to get to, overcame feudalism to become essentially a bureaucratic empire that was highly centralized, with the emperor at the center. England overcomes feudalism slowly in favor of a limited constitutional government. France overcame feudalism through absolutism, and Japan then is feudal really all the way through. The essence of feudalism, remember, is power diffused and quarreled about among autonomous lords, each supported by warrior elites. And this in Japan, instead of like the chivalric code, you had Bushido. This was in the code of the samurai, which was their warrior class, stressing, obedience, honor, selfless commitment to duty. This is again very similar to what you had in medieval Europe with its trinity of king, lords, knights, and it corresponds to medieval Japan where they were the shogun, the daimyo, which were the regional lords, and then the samurai, which were the warrior elite. And that's an important point, is that it's not really central to our story because we're really interested in explaining modern Japan, and modern Japan really grows out of a reaction against attempts by Western powers, specifically the United States, to open Japan up to trade in the 19th century. And there's a crash course modernization to try and bring Japan up to speed. And so we're going to be mostly interested in that because it's that's the most instructive thing that I can tell you. But I will just note that the emperor then, though he existed, he was more of a figurehead, and there was really this shogunate is what it's called, if you hear it referenced, and they were essentially the most powerful military commander, and it was them who basically ran the country. So. Remember, Europe started growing out of feudalism around the 15th century as the modernizing monarchs started crushing their aristocratic competition, founding that strong centralized state. The first Europeans to reach Japan, Portuguese, 1543, followed by the Spaniards in 1587, and then the Dutch in 1609. And very soon, European traders and Catholic missionaries were making inroads. Japan's rulers, though, really feared this foreign influence, especially things like Christianity, and they banned it and excluded them. Japanese were forbidden to travel abroad under the shogunate. In 1635, that was made policy, and it was a broadened Sukoku, which meant kind of the chaining off of the archipelago, which lasted until the mid 19th century. So it's sort of this self-imposed uh, isolation, preventing the Japanese people from going out, preventing foreigners from coming in. The Tokugawa clan were the ones who were doing this. They had won a major battle in 1600 and established a very powerful shogunate. Um, they your textbook references as sort of a proto-police state with kind of police spies everywhere. Um, This is the period though when the capital is moved from Kyoto, which is a now Buddhist cultural site, to Edo, which is modern Tokyo. And there was just one Dutch trading post, and this was on an island in Nagasaki Harbor. Otherwise, Japan shut the door to foreigners. And the Tokugawa shoguns sort of feared the destabilizing effects of foreigners, the gaijin. Uh, and one thing that is important to know here, this closing off, this is one of the things that's going to prompt the Americans to make repeated visits. There is wrecked soldiers on the islands. It's very difficult to get sailors back. Um, by the mid 19th century, this is not to say that Japan was not prospering. Japan was a very prosperous and highly developed without Western influence. There was a very wealthy merchant middle class, um, but in the United States was doing business on the Chinese coast, and Western sailors were often shipwrecked on Japanese islands, and it was very difficult to get them back. They had to operate through that Dutch trading post. It could take a very long time. Furthermore, in the race for overseas markets, with which the late 19th century is really the apogee of European imperial expansion in this race to gobble up colonies. And Japan is looking ripe for commercial expansion because you could be an economic colony without being an actual physical possession, and that was really what you were more interested in. Even the really ardent traders like Cobden were very interested in having the benefits of trade with all these different nations. They just didn't want the military cost imposed of actual direct rule. So in 1846, two U.S. warships are going to call and request diplomatic relations. They get rebuffed. Millard Fillmore orders Commodore Matthew Perry to open Japan, and he arrives in 53 with four ships that combine steam and sail, and these are very intimidating. Essentially, the implied threat being that we're going to make a demonstration on your towns if you don't open up relations with us. And at the same time, they could look across the water. The Japanese were in contact with the Chinese Qing through couriers. They could see what was happening in China at the time. I'm not even going to get into what was going on in China at the time. Suffice to say, this incredibly powerful neighbor who had dominated the area for as long as anyone could remember, really, was being preyed upon by these Western powers and really taken advantage of. And they essentially decided that the rulers of Japan essentially said they weren't going to be able to keep out these foreigners, and that it would be better to kind of acquiesce and go along with it rather than be opened up by force like the Chinese were in a series of wars, which are called the Opium Wars, which we will, of course, get to. So, in 1868, there is an attempt by the leadership under the Tokugawa shogunate to save Japan by modernizing quickly before the West could take it over. And there's a new emperor put in place, Mutsuhito, and this is called the Meiji Restoration, and it's really a crash course modernization of everything from education to military to industry to commerce. The Tokugawa shogunate was definitely was technically gone. The emperor was in place, but he was really just a nationalistic symbol for rule by those same samurai clans who had been dominating, going all the way back to the feudal period. Rich nation, strong army. This was the motto, and Japan went from basically the late Middle Ages, early modern period of town burghers and small time capitalism, to basically the modern age. The daimyo, these big lords, they lost their hereditary estates, but they were basically put in charge of the new industries. So feudalism ended, and all the Japanese were legally equal, and no longer could, like for example, a samurai kill someone for disrespecting them. It was a very controlled revolution from the top. These daimyo and samurai clans were given monopolies on branches of industry in order to develop them, and these formed the basis of industrial conglomerates called the zaibatsu. The zaibatsu would survive all the way through the World War II and be reformed under the keiretsu. So it's actually there's a lot of continuity, and unlike in the German case where there was at least some denazification that went on, except for hanging a few people who were in the military leadership. MacArthur basically just takes all the same people who were running the Japanese government before the war and during the war and just puts them in charge after the war. And this has major implications for how Japan was perceived by its neighbors, especially the Koreans, especially the Chinese, because of what happened during World War II. And I'll touch on that a little bit because it is germane to the contemporary relations of Japan to its neighbors. They went out and these modernizers, they went out and copied what they felt worked best in each situation. And so, for example, they took British shipbuilding and naval warfare, French commercial law and civil organization, German medical care, steelmaking, and army organization. They grabbed a constitution and a political system modeled on the newly unified Germany, which was very top-down, tightly controlled, and really a managed representative system. And this is in 1889, the Japanese constitution is introduced. It included a monarch, that was the emperor, and elected parliament and political parties. But underneath these patterns of governance, the Japanese were basically being governed and brokered by the traditional power holders. It only looked democratic from the outside. Japan's economy, though, starts growing rapidly. And from 1885 to 1919, Japan doubled its per capita GDP. The very, very strong economic growth here. And this is going to put them on the path of collision with its neighbors. Now, just a second here. Terribly sorry for that that awkward pause there. I heard the dinging noise that was telling my computer is literally about to shut off. So my apologies. My apologies there. Okay, back to where we were. On the road to conflict with their neighbors. Yes, because as you can see, Japan is an island, and I already told you that it is very mountainous, and there's not a lot of arable land. There's also not a lot of resources there. It's not a resource-rich place. And what do you need for industrialization? Well, you need oil and coal and iron ore and stuff, none of which Japan has. And so they're going to need to compete for access to markets here. Now, as I said, this right here is still Russia to this modern day, but at the time, Tsarist Russia was pushing right up here against corn. They had lopped a huge piece of China off here. They were really butting right up against each other here, and it looked like there was going to be conflict over domination of the Korean Peninsula. There's lots of great harbors here, and the Russians, as always, were looking for good all-weather ports. They just don't have very many. To this very day, they don't have very many. And so this was a point of conflict. And Japan is going to get into conflict with them and with China. So with its new modern Western army, Japan picks a fight with China, defeats China in the First Sino-Japanese War. This is the minor one in 1895, the major one, the Second Sino-Japanese War that's going to kill, tens of millions of people. That one is going to be in the 1930s, in the run up to World War II. It's going to carry through World War II. Actually, most of the Japanese military power is on mainland China. The Americans never even see it. This initial fight it's right here on the Korean Peninsula. It's a very limited engagement, and the Japanese quickly win. But they seize Taiwan. They seize Taiwan as a prize, and Taiwan is down here, kind of. It's right on the string of these islands. It's right on the bootstrings there. So, and they take sort of suzerainty over Korea and make it into basically a colony. They make it a colony in 1910. So, in 1904. Amid growing tensions, Japan, without warning, attacked the Russian Far Eastern Fleet on the Manchurian coast. I will just say, yes, it was a surprise attack, but and Japan did start this war, but Russia definitely provoked it. The Russian government was being very belligerent. The Japanese had asked them many times, "Hey, can we, kind of talk about dividing up some spheres of influence here?" And the Russians just ignored them and increased pressure on them. And the Japanese attacked them in a way that was reminiscent to what would happen later in World War II. Again, Japan starts it, but as we'll talk about, there's every reason to say that certainly from their view that the Americans were provoking it. So in 1904, they defeat Russia. And this is actually sort of a huge deal, actually, because it is the first time in, gosh, hundreds of years that a non-Western power, that a non-European power, which Russia at the time was very much considered European. Russia today, as we'll talk about, I believe, yeah, next week. Next week is Russia, I think. Well, when we talk about Russia, we'll see that there's always been this kind of tension between like Eurasianists who think of Russia as being an Asian country, special, you're not part of Europe, and then those who are Western facing who say no, Russia, it's a large population centers, cultural, it's mostly European. Well, anyway, this was a major shock. No European power had lost a military conflict to an Asiatic power in longer than anyone could remember. It was a huge, shocking defeat, and they crushed them. The Japanese crushed the Russians. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904, 1905, it actually causes a large deal of political unrest in Russia. I won't get sucked into that. We'll talk about that when we talk about Russia. But this was right around the same time too that the Japanese were getting support from the British. The British saw them as a great potential ally because usually we tend to think of this period as being, the British are predominantly thinking about Germany, Germany, Germany. Actually, Russia was considered the bigger problem because the Russians were threatening the approaches to India, constantly causing them problems there, and so the Japanese were seen as a good bet by the British to kind of hem them in on that side. So. the these Aibatsu, these were growing into economic giants, and they bought lots of control. Japanese politicians became very close with them. Just as today there was a very close relationship between private industry and politics. That's true in all the cases that we've looked at. It's true in France. It's true in Britain. It's true in the United States. It's also true in Japan. Now, the problem here, though, and this is interesting, is because there's the Japanese pie is growing. Wages are staying small, though. The standard of living is going to continue to grow as long as this carries on. There is a very large divide in the 1920s, and there are books written about this, about sort of the delicateness of Japanese political life during this time. It was very, very violent. There were many assassinations during this time. And it is in part this great tension because there's this mass of sort of urban working class who is really not seeing a lot of political power. As I said, it was a very carefully managed democracy from above. Um, you know, you have this upper class who's very connected to the government, who's getting a lot richer. The middle class is getting poorer. There are peasants starving, and essentially the government looks illegitimate. It lends more and more influence and power to the army, the officer corps. A real hotbed of right-wing nationalism and emperor worship turns against democracy and capitalism in the 1920s, subverts them, kills multiple political figures, and really kind of seizes control of the government, as we're going to see. The Japanese military was really running itself without even informing the cabinet or the diplomats, even more so than Kaiser Wilhelm after World War I started, who was kind of a prisoner of his own generals. This is very true of Emperor Hirohito in terms of the expansion that occurs. The Japanese army, for example, is going to conquer Manchuria in 1931 and build its own state, Manchukuo. And this was where a lot of the natural resources were going to be that were going to fuel Japan's continued industrial development. Because the idea was here that these other powers are carving out spheres of influence around the world. And it was very common for people to say, well, what makes England great? Well, the British Empire. And what is the crown jewel of the British Empire? Well, it's India. And again, even really free trader, anti-imperialist types like Richard Cobden, John Bright, they agreed that India was critical to British national wealth, even those guys. So for Japan, they said, well, we're going to make our own India out of China. It's one of the only places that hasn't been colonized. It's rich. It's nearby. We need access to these markets. And this is going to be especially true. You see the date 1931 after the Great Depression, because what happens in the face of the Great Depression is tariff barriers start going up all over the developed world. This is absolutely devastating for Japan because it was totally dependent on globalization, on the free flow of goods, importing and exporting. Once it's locked out of these other markets, it really feels no choice other than to seek self-sufficiency by acquiring colonies of its own. Again, it cannot be self-sufficient. Unlike the United States, which could be self-sufficient, Japan simply could not be self-sufficient. So, uh, they do want so, and this is in the 1930s. They wind up starting well, I guess it's kind of conflict. I mean, the Japanese are in China. Chiang Kai-shek, who's ruling China, but at this point as sort of the military dictator there, they start clashing. The Second Sino-Japanese War gets kicked off. That's all very complicated, not terribly important. It's more important for discussion of China, which will come later, because that's important to the internal politics of China, because it's the communists versus the nationalists, and that's all tied into the Second Sino-Japanese War. So all I'll say now is in 1931, Japan, the militarists in Japan very faithfully start their involvement in China. And this is going to keep China bogged down. China. This is going to keep Japan, sorry, it's late. What time is it? It's after 10 o'clock, which for me is late. Sorry. This is going to keep the bulk of the Japanese military tied down on China. They're never going to be able to win the war outright. There's just too many people. Something like 35 million people get killed in the Second Sino-Japanese War on the Chinese mainland. There's tons of atrocities. It's super horrible, and it's a morass. It's a quagmire. It's an unwinnable war, and it's going to really cost Japan a lot. So that being said, this really its moves in China. They're going to move to oust down here. They're going to move to boot the French out of Indochina, which is Vietnam. They're going to threaten the British colonies down here. They're going to kick the Dutch out of their colonies here in the Indonesian Spice Islands. And right down here off your screen, we don't think of America as being an Asian power, but the United States had let's see, we're in the 30s, about 35 years previously acquired the Philippines in a war with Spain. So the United States was directly ruling and occupying the Philippines, which are right here. And so there had been people calling for war with Japan going all the way back to really the 1890s. This was one of the big reasons that they were like, we have to take Hawaii, because if we don't take Hawaii, the expanding Japanese empire will take Hawaii. So there had been people calling for war with Japan for 20, 30 years. And this move into China, which is seen as impeding a U.S. Program, which was called the Open Door, which was we are always to have an open door to China. The Japanese are cutting this off. And so this is going to really sour relations between Japan and the United States, which were not terribly good Anyway, the Japanese say that they are creating an Asia for the Asians. They're kicking the Europeans out, and that the Asians just need a strong Asian power to defend the rights of the Asians. Of course, instead they turn around and basically just take the role of the former occupiers. It's just now we're ruling you instead of the British. If you look on page 189 of your textbook, you'll see sort of the variations of the flags, which you know me, I'm a big fan of looking at the flags. So if you're interested, there it is, 189. The Great Pacific War. Uh, Yes, because of course Japan had been on the side of the Entente powers in World War One, but it hadn't actually really been involved in the fighting. It had been not involved at all. It had been Britain's ally, and when the war started, it basically just took the couple of German colonies over here, including a section in China, and said, okay, we took care of the Germans over here, and we'll just hold on to these. And this is one of the things that really sours American opinion and also Chinese opinion on America and the League of Nations at the time is uh long story short, but basically uh Wilson allows the Japanese to keep these Chinese possessions that he had promised China would get back during Versailles in order to get the Japanese to sign on to the League of Nations. But Japan becomes rather disaffected with the League of Nations. They feel like it's kind of a club of the Western imperialist powers to try and keep other countries down. For example, they had tried to introduce a statement on racial equality stating that it is the belief of this body that all races are equal. And Britain and France and whatnot, they were like, yeah, we don't be interested in that. But so it was always an uncomfortable marriage there. The Japanese recused themselves after the Mukden incident, which starts the war in Manchuria. It's condemned by the League. Japan walks out, and this though is going to lead to the Americans becoming more and more belligerent, especially once the Roosevelt administration is in charge. Because Hoover had said, we'll register a protest. We don't want to get involved. Uh, the uh, the FDR administration feels differently. In 1937, the Japanese army decides that, well, we're not secure here. We keep getting in these fights along our border that we're establishing with Manchukuo with China. We're just going to have a fight with China. The United States supporting China, wishing to avoid war at this point, takes cautious steps, aid, different things like that. In 1940, though, it embargoes oil and scrap steel to Japan, and it freezes Japanese assets in American banks, starts organizing sort of a paramilitary flying squadron, and this is kind of the last straw for the Japanese. They had tried to make an accommodation with the United States. The Roosevelt administration wasn't interested, and war came. Uh, the there was very little belief that they could actually win the war. That's one thing that I encountered in my studies of this. It was not that they believed they could win the war, that with some quick strike they could knock the Americans out of the war. Um, it was really more just that they felt like they were being put in a position where backing down to the Americans was just too humiliating. And there's a whole section in the book here where the author talks about the role of shame. And this was an inheritance of sort of the feudal militarist samurai culture, that the idea that the shame of backing down would just have been too much. And the war comes. I won't even go into the war. The war happens. Um, the bombs are dropped. Uh, every major Japanese city is basically rubble by 1945. Douglas MacArthur and his staff, they come in, and they basically set up a whole new constitution. As I said, they basically keep the emperor. He's no longer going to be seen as a divine figurehead. He's just going to rule as a normal man who is the emperor. They cover up Hirohito's support for the war and blame Hideki Tojo, basically the wartime prime minister, and a few dozen helpers, and they hang all of them, and and uh, and set up Japan as a client state in the new Cold War. And the author of your book, who is by no means a revisionist historian, he was an American diplomat, taught at American University. Even he concedes that in 1947, the decision to rebuild Japan as an industrialized, strong state and a U.S. client was prompted entirely by Cold War thinking. That is the Russians, the North Koreans, the war in China between the commies and the nationalists was going on, and it was starting to go very poorly. The idea was that Japan was going to be a frontline state against the commies. And this same thing happened, we mentioned, in Germany, that they rebuilt West Germany. Remember, West Germany was supposed to be like farmland. But then, in the context of the Cold War, they realized they wanted a strong industrial power right there on the doorstep. And so basically, Japan is the West Germany of the East here. And so this all happens in the context of the Cold War. So when you wonder, well, why did the United States impose these successful governments and institutions and economies on these defeated rival states? Well, the United States administration had its reasons for doing that. MacArthur's staff wrote the new Constitution, modeling largely British institutions, as we'll see. It has changed since then, but there you have it. As I said, the real point here is that underneath all of the cosmetic changes, what you did have really was the Zaibatsu, which was the old noble families, the old noble samurai clan leading families who had been moved off the land into the cities to take control of these industrial concerns, basically get reformed under the new name Keiretsu. Most of the bureaucracy is retained, and most of the political elites just return to political power. And as we'll see here, when we talk about we're going to talk about the key institutions next, and we'll move into political personalities in the context of talking about that. We're going to see that there's actually, even more so than in other political, in other states and other case studies that we've looked at, elected office tends to be almost an inherited thing in Japan. So next time, institutions.